Hey, what's up, guys? Once again, we got Lovecraft, H.P. Lovecraft selects. I'm gonna go over the white people. I'm gonna say it properly for this video out of respect. And we have what is this? Whoa! I'm starting to read this book by Hippocampus Press, The Secret Ceremonies, critical essays on Arthur Machen. Now, you could laugh about when I do the Rue Morgue videos, like, why do you buy that? Well, I wouldn't even know this book existed if it hadn't been for the Rue Morgue issue probably a year and a half ago. So there's always opportunities in everything, as I keep saying. It's something someone told me years ago, and it's really coming true now. But the white people. This was written in 1899, published I think in 1904. This is a story. It's bookended by like a typical Machen device, which is basically because it's from the late 1800s. It's the dandies, a bunch of British dandies, talking about the nature of whatever. In the middle of the story is a girl's, I guess, diary, the green book, right, the yellow book, right, all these things, and it's written in a prose. Is essentially a prose poem. As you can see, there's no indents, and the girl just keeps writing and writing and writing. But it's essentially sort of a prose poem. It describes, as I was going to mention, Machen's recurring themes of the little people, the fairy folk, the old paganism. Like I had mentioned in the last review, horror is a pagan reflex. Now, Machen is associated with the decadent movement. The man was a kind of an Anglo-Catholic. He definitely was not a decadent in his practices, but a lot of his stories, they're probably the best decadent horror stories you have. Now, mind you, your modern horror comes out of that movement from the French and Oscar Wilde and a bunch of others. But this guy wrote what Lovecraft would later, call weird tales thing. The stories all deal usually with the concept that I keep getting at with what I'm trying to explain is that to the European, there's something behind the veil, okay, and especially modernity blinds you to that materialism. But there's something behind the veil that is older, and there's a seeking of it. It's almost like a seductive thing. It's also terrifying. Okay, that's what horror is. Horror films are essentially that, right? You're sublimating horror of whatever kind of thing you can think of that which should not be, to a horrible fate. You go through it and then you exercise it, right? The ancient world knew that through their the ancient Greeks mentioned that, and also what's his name, Schiller, one of the German idealists, romanticists, mentioned that. I keep mentioning German romanticism. It's like, oh, it's like mostly macabre. So anyway, the story itself, okay? The dialogue in the beginning, I always like the dialogue. I always like the fact that he uses these dandy characters. I can imagine like a Hammer adaptation, or maybe more like a Tyburn adaptation. Imagine Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing speaking these words. Sorcery and sanctity, said Ambrose. These are the only realities. Each is an ecstasy, a withdrawal from the common life. Cotgrave listened interested. He had been brought to a friend to this mouldering house in a northern suburb, through an old garden to the room where Ambrose, the recluse, dozed and dreamed over his books. Yes, he went on, magic is justified of her children. There are many, I think, who eat dry crusts and drink water, the joy infinitely sharper than anything within the experience of the practical epicure. You are speaking of the saints? Can you imagine a movie like this? Would have been awesome. Yes, and of the sinners too. I think you are falling into the very general error of confining the spiritual world to the supremely good. But the supremely wicked necessarily have their portion in it. The merely carnal, sensual man can no more be a great sinner than he can be a great saint. Most of us are just indifferent, mixed-up creatures. We muddle through the world without realizing the meaning and the inner sense of things. And consequently, our wickedness and our goodness are alike second-rate, unimportant. Wow. That was amazing writing right there. Anyway, so they're talking. There's the intro is as much fun as the very, very different middle portion, right? I'll just read one more thing. Yes, but in one place the word sorcerers come in the same sentence, doesn't it? That seems to me to give the keynote. Consider, can you imagine for a moment that a false statement which saves an innocent man's life is a sin? No? Very good, then it is not the mere liar who is excluded by those words. It is above all the sorcerers who use the material life, who use the failings incidental to material life as instruments to obtain their infinitely wicked ends. And let me tell you this, our higher senses are so blunted, we are so drenched with materialism that we should probably fail to recognize real wickedness if we encountered it. I tell you, man, you read these stories from the 19th century, especially the decadence and this Lovecraft too. I would include that. They knew what was coming. They knew what was acting back then. Anyway, so the story as they discuss these things, and there's he mentions an anecdote of a girl who had written in something called the Green Book. She wrote like a diary. So now the interesting part is you essentially notice what there's no indents. The girl just keeps writing and writing and writing. This is a prose poem. Okay, Arthur Machen actually have was it Ornaments in Jade, or prose poems he wrote around the same period, but they're not published until I think the 1920s. They're on par, or they must have been read by Clark Ashton Smith, who I'll cover at some point too. Probably the greatest prose poem writer ever. Okay, next to Robinson Jeffers to me was Clark Ashton Smith, who's remembered as a Weird Tales writer. The guy was on another level, and was also definitely influenced by Machen. So, in the story, I'll read some of the prose here. It's a little girl, right, and it's a diary of her nurse. This is all taking place in Wales, okay, the Welsh country. Where you have forests, you still have a pagan past, you have a Celtic people, not Scottish or Irish, who were at one point subjugated by another pagan people, the Romans. Okay, the shadow of the Roman occupation of Britain is always in many of his stories, because where he grew up, you actually still heard Roman ruins, aqueducts and little statues and whatnot. That's amazing to me to think of that. So I'll just read some of the example of this beautiful, lush prose poetry, almost you'd say. I came to a hill that I never saw before. I was in a dismal thicket full of black, twisted boughs that tore me as I went through them, and I cried out because I was smarting all over. And then I found out that I was climbing, and I went up and up a long way till at last the thicket stopped, and I came out crying just under the top of a big bare place where there were ugly gray stones lying all about on the grass, and here and there a little twisted, stunted tree came out from under a stone like a snake. And I went up right to the top, a long way. I never saw such big ugly stones before. They came out of the earth, some of them, and some looked as if they had been rolled to where they were. And they went on and on as far as I could see, a long, long way. I looked out from them and saw the country, but it was strange. It was winter time, and there were black, terrible woods hanging from the hills all round. It was like seeing a large room hung with black curtains, and the shape of the trees seemed quite different from any I had ever seen before. I was afraid. Then beyond the woods there were other hills round in a great ring, but I had never seen any of them. It all looked black, and everything had a vor over it. It was all so still and silent, and the sky was heavy and gray and sad. My favorite weather. Like a wicked, voorish dome in deep Dendo. I don't even know what Dendo is. I went on into the dreadful rocks. There were hundreds and hundreds of them. Some of them were like horrid, grinning men. I could see their faces as if they would jump out at me of the stone and catch hold of me and drag me with them back into the rock, so that I should always be there. And there were other rocks that were like animals, creeping, horrible animals, putting out their tongues, and others were like words that I could not say, and others like dead people lying on the grass. I went on among them, though they frightened me, and my heart was full of wicked songs that they put into it. And I wanted to make faces and twist myself about in the way they did. And I went on a long way till at last I liked the rocks, and they didn't frighten me anymore. I sang the songs I thought of, songs full of words that must not be spoken or written down. Then I made faces like the faces on the rocks, and I twisted myself about like the twisted ones, and I lay down flat on the ground like the dead ones. And I went up to one that was grinning and put my arms around him and hugged him. And I went up to the one that was grinning. Right? Oh, I finished that. Okay, so yeah, that's a really amazing writing, and it goes on and on. Okay, and eventually it ends with an epilogue. Right, the dandies are talking about what became of that girl. Right? And in the story, she describes the the white people. Who are the white people? Right, these little people, male and female, that she sees. With cream-like, very white skin, but very dark hair, very dark eyes. The fairy folk. Well, in my opinion, these are the original Europeans, right? The darker, kind of shorter, dark-haired Europeans that existed, that the various Aryan invasions encountered. Okay, there also could be a racial memory to those people with the Neanderthals. Okay, these little people, dark-haired people who still exist. They steal your children and trade them with theirs. Right? These legends exist as a racial memory, in my opinion, for a reason. Okay, the Neanderthals, the Cro-Magnons. You still see them in people. You see dark-haired, short people from England to Russia, and even all the way up to Scandinavia and into, of course, Italy. Okay, separate from whatever Asiatic nomads were nearby. So it's just, I don't know. To me, it was great. It really is an amazing story. It's very evocative, very lush, and I recommend it highly. And I recommend Arthur Machen's work in general. The Three Imposters is actually, that and The Great God Pan are probably my favorite stories of his. But he has so many more. An amazing guy, one of the best decadent writers ever, and the guy was hardly decadent in his actions. He was actually a pretty decent man from what I've read. So, anyway, another great story that, as I had mentioned before, it resonates even now, even more so in this empty, flat world of materialism that we live in. So, all right, let me get to the next one, man. We're gonna bust the content out, whether you like it or not. Later.